Okay, so I'd like to once again welcome everyone to the student showcase, the graduate student showcase. We've got 4 presenters today on a wide range of topics. And coming up first, we have Scott. So Scott will introduce himself. And he is going to be talking about the effects of recursive conversations on L2 English learners speaking competence. So over to you, Scott. You should be able to share your screen.
Okay, let's give it a try. How's that?
Looking good, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Scott. I'm a lecturer at Nagoya Gakuin University in Japan, and I'm a PhD candidate at Nagoya University of Foreign Studies. So here we go. So first, I'm just going to talk a little bit about complex dynamic systems theory, because that's what my research is based on. And I'm going to use this beautiful picture of a valley to do it. Of course, it would be remiss of me not to mention this lady, Diane Lawson Freeman. So she really kind of kicked off the use of complex dynamic systems theory in language and education. In 1997, she made this great article, just kind of discussing like all the features of it and how language seems to fit this theory, and that maybe we should be using it to think about how language works and how language teaching should work. And depending on who you ask and kind of what time of day it is, every person will give you kind of a slightly different list of the various features of complex dynamic systems. So I'm going to give you 10 here, which I think are useful and relevant to language learning, and especially language learning from the viewpoint of kind of a neuroscientific idea. So first, from this idea that language is complex. So using this picture here, we can see that there are so many different things going on in this valley. We've got the water, we've got all the rocks, the vegetation, the animals, the weather. There are so many different parts, and that's what we mean by complex. Dynamic, meaning that things always change. You're never kind of at a standstill. There's always movement in some kind of direction. Chaotic, really meaning that it's difficult to predict how things change and what factors might affect things in what way. So, for example, looking at this river valley, we can probably guess that maybe some kind of waterfall develop at some point, but it's kind of hard to say when that might happen and where. We might guess that the cliffs up at the top might collapse at some point, but again, it's kind of hard to predict what's going to happen when. So that's what we mean by chaotic. Feedback sensitive, meaning that if there's a change in one direction, that itself can cause further change in the same direction. So let's say, for example, we've got this vegetation in the valley that as it dies, increases the amount of soil. And that means the soil is capable of supporting more and more vegetation. That's a feedback sensitive system. Emergent, meaning that if we just look at the individual parts, it doesn't really give you an overall picture of what's happening. It's the kind of interactions between all these parts coming together is what creates the overall thing. In this case, it's all of these different factors coming together that create this beautiful river valley. Or another example might be how the way that all the birds in a flock interact with each other creates these amazing patterns in the sky. That's another kind of emergent behavior. Iterative, meaning that anything that happens in the future to this system is based on what happened in the past. So if you want to try and guess how things might change, you have to look at how things are. I think there's a really obvious comparison to language in that we create materials for learners that's based on where we think they are now and where we want to get them, because we're trying to iterate on what they already know. Systems are open, meaning outside forces can come in and change things. Maybe some diggers will come in and dug up some parts of these valleys, that kind of thing. The same with language. Us being teachers, we're specifically interacting with our students' system. And adaptive, meaning that if there's some kind of force acting on the system, that'll change the system, and it'll kind of adapt to meet the needs of whatever's happening. And there's this really interesting thing that tends to happen where you see this fractality with complex systems, where if you zoom out or you zoom in, you tend to see the same kind of patterns at different levels. So I think the most famous example of that is broccoli, right? Where the big whole broccoli, if you zoom in on it and look at individual kind of stalks, they're the same shape as the big broccoli. And we kind of see that kind of thing with language too. And the last one, constrained. So this river valley most likely is not going to turn into a spaceship and fly away. There are like certain physical limits on what kind of changes can happen. So that does allow some element of predictability. Okay, so there's this really interesting concept with complex systems where we have this kind of edge of chaos, which is where a system is kind of not necessarily completely ordered, not completely chaotic, but is kind of maybe flickering between and kind of on the edge of these two different states. And we see a ton in nature. And I'm a little bit of a kind of neuroscience focused researcher, and this is really key to how the brain works, and especially learning and memory consolidation. What studies have shown is that when we're sleeping, the brain kind of flickers between these chaotic and stable states, and it's this kind of this kind of edge of chaos behavior that actually leads to a lot of the learning and the consolidation of memories while we're sleeping. Isn't that a great picture of the brain, by the way? That's the connector, trying to look at all the different connections between different parts of the brain. And we can also kind of think of this concept looking at the classroom too. So Kumai's done some really interesting stuff, looking at kind of how we can view learning in the classroom from a kind of edge of chaos perspective, where we can try and take advantage of it. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with the idea of the zone of proximal development from sociocultural theory. I think that's actually kind of a good analogy where as teachers, we're trying to get students in a state where they're kind of at the limits of what they know, and they're kind of bringing in new stuff. That's that kind of like edge of chaos kind of situation. And I think task-based language teaching too is kind of a pretty good example of it, where we don't exactly know what each student's going to do in the task we do. We're going to try and kind of adapt to them and help the individuals in whatever it is they need to learn to complete the task, that kind of thing. I'd say that's kind of a good unintentional application of kind of edge of chaos ideas. So what I've been looking at is recursive conversations, which come from these kind of complexity ideas. So really, all it is at heart is having conversations about a particular topic with multiple partners. That's really all it is. It's very simple. So let's say in my situation, it's usually you talk with a partner about, for example, hobbies for 5 minutes. Then you talk with a new partner about hobbies for 5 minutes, and then you talk with another partner about hobbies for 5 minutes. Very simple. So these are the questions that I have for my PhD. Mostly I'll just be focusing on the third one, question 3. but I'll go through all of them. So the first question, what are the immediate effects of these recursive conversations on learners' language use in general? Second question is, do recursive conversations lead to increased awareness and usage of taught conversation strategies? And then the third one, which I'll talk about today, is how do recursive conversations influence the development of interactional competence in a second language over a kind of longer time? So in this case, over the course of an entire academic year. And in order to kind of measure that, I've adapted Pangan-Skian's CARF, so complexity, accuracy, lexical complexity, and fluency. And this is what we kind of get. So actually, they've done some really interesting work and found that actually what we think of as complexity, accuracy, lexical complexity, and fluency are actually, apart from accuracy, there are actually several different things. Fluency, especially, that fluency maybe doesn't exist to some extent. It's actually like several different things that we tend to group together. So what I'm going to talk about today is accuracy. So in this case, that's the ratio of clauses that don't contain any errors versus the total clauses that students use in a conversation. And then I'll look at just one factor of fluency, which is how many silent pauses there are. And these pauses must be longer than 0.4 seconds. Okay, here we go. So here are the participants. So I looked at two groups of first-year students in a Japanese university, both non-English majors, one group from social studies and one from economics. So I had the group one do the recursive conversations, and group two, instead of recursive conversations, they did more kind of traditional stuff, focus practice, basically PPP. So basically it's looking at PPP versus recursive conversations. 24 members in one group, 17 in the other. So the groups are big enough to do statistical comparison, but just barely. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So right at the beginning of the year, all the participants were given a vocabulary test. And so this was a vocabulary test looking at the different vocabulary levels going up to the 5,000 most frequent words. And they got mean scores of 2,700 and 2,600 for receptive vocabulary knowledge, which puts them pretty much kind of on the border between A2 and B1 in CEFA. So kind of like upper beginner kind of level, basically. And then in the bottom left corner, you can see I did a version of t-test for small groups called the Mann-Whitney U-test. And it showed that there was no statistical difference between their scores at any of the levels. So I took that as a good sign that we could go ahead and compare them over the course of the year. Okay, so this is what the actual classes look like. So for the PPP class, the focus practice class, first they read and discussed an example dialogue which contained a particular topic and a conversation strategy that they had to learn and use. Then they would write and record a dialogue in pairs. Then they would do 10 minutes of focus practice. So focus practice meaning in this case, I think everybody's done those activities where you have like a dialogue that you give students that has gaps in it for them to kind of speak and fill in, like, hello, my name is blank, that kind of thing. And then they did a 5-minute open conversation. The recursive conversation class was similar, apart from the end. Oh yeah, and they also did a self-review activity every week. With the recursive conversation class, we did the same dialogue and writing and recording in pairs. But then instead of doing 10 minutes of focus practice and 5 minutes of conversation. We just did 15 minutes of open conversations. We just did 3 recursive conversations, and then we did the self-review. And this is how I collected the data. So for the data I'm going to be talking about today, it's using a recorded final speaking test conducted on the last day of the year. These were then transcribed, coded, and quantized. Quantized meaning just that I coded for the clauses, looking at clauses containing error or not, and also counting up all the silent pauses in the conversations, and then put them in Excel, did some data analysis in Excel, then moved to JASP, which is a free open source statistical software that you can download. I think it's the University of Amsterdam. It's really, really good. And these are the results. So first, looking at the frequency of silent pauses. So this is pauses longer than 0.4 seconds. So first, looking at silent pauses per minute, we see that with group 1, the recursive conversations group, they have a mean of 7 pauses per minute versus 10 for the focus practice group. And then just looking at kind of like the total number of pauses, I thought was interesting too, rather than per minute. So total number of pauses on average was 40 for the recursive conversations group and 54 for the focus practice group. So you can see a difference, but is it significant is the question. So down below, you can see the t-test, that's Mann-Whitney test. So for both pauses per minute and the total pauses, it found a significant difference between the two, more so for pauses per minute. So what does that mean? Well, I think the easiest way really is to look at the mean scores for pauses per minute. You can see 7 versus 10. So that's about a 30% reduction in the number of pauses per minute for the group that were doing recursive conversations for the year instead of the focus practice, which I was kind of shocked by. Actually, I was expecting their fluency might be a little higher, but it was quite a lot higher. And then I also looked at the length of the pauses and found that for the recursive conversations group and the other group, they're pretty much the same, 1.235 seconds versus 1.165 seconds for the average pause length. And it showed to be not significant, actually. Although, you know, so it's kind of worth noting that actually on average, they did have a slightly longer pause, although nothing to really think about. Then looking at silent pause total time, just out of the 5-minute conversation, how much of that time was pause time? And again, we see a difference. So for the recursive conversations group, 46 seconds on average out of 5 minutes versus a little bit over a minute for the focus practice group. And this turned out to be significant. Whether you looked at it at total or per minute, both were significant. In fact, per minute was more significant. So again, we see about a 30% difference, which makes sense really, because the pause time was about the same. They were just the group who'd been doing recursive conversations were pausing much less. And moving on now to accuracy. So here the RC's group, of their total clauses that they produced in the 5-minute conversation, 46% of them were error-free versus 39% for the focus practice group. So this much closer. And again, doing a t-test on it, they do appear to be a significant difference. So just turning that difference into a percentage, that's an 18% difference in accuracy over 1 year, which was quite surprising to me, actually, because my kind of idea going into this would be that probably the recursive conversations would have a positive effect on fluency, but that maybe that would be counteracted by increased accuracy from the focus practice of the other group. But that wasn't the case. Much higher accuracy and fluency for the recursive conversations. So just in summary, after 1 academic year, in comparison to the PPP group, the recursive conversations group had 30% fewer pauses per minute, 30% lower total pause time, 18% more error-free clauses, but 6% longer pauses, although there's an asterisk next to that because it was not a statistically significant difference. So essentially from the areas I've measured so far, we see a 30% higher fluency and 20% higher accuracy versus more kind of traditional speaking tasks. And just some implications of this. So I would say that based on this, we can say that recursive conversations are significantly more effective as a classroom tool than traditional focused practice methods if the goal is fluency and accuracy. Although you guys might have noticed I didn't mention complexity because I haven't had a chance to analyze that yet. So that might change things a little bit, we'll see. So it kind of calls into question a little bit whether we really need many of these kind of like really heavily scaffolded activities in a classroom, that actually when we're planning our lessons, maybe we can throw away a lot of these like very clearly defined, very careful activities and actually do some more kind of more chaotic, more open stuff that might be more beneficial for the students. So essentially what I'm saying is maybe a little bit less time doing practice activities and more time just doing things, doing kind of real conversation. So going forward, so far I've only looked at 2 out of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 out of 12 different factors. So going ahead, it might turn out that there are some areas where actually the focus practice turned out to be better. My gut instinct is that probably not, just based on how the classes worked out over the year, but we shall see. So I'll be looking at all of these things this year, and then also then I'll be going back to the other research questions and kind of looking at some more qualitative stuff, so looking at individual students and how they changed over the year and comparing. And also just interviewing the students to see what their experience of the classes were. So yeah, there are the research questions again. So I'll be going back to those. Okay, thank you very much. If you need any more detail, or you would like lesson plans, or any other reason you might have to contact me, that's my email address there. Please feel free to get in touch. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. That was really illuminating, a really interesting piece of research there. So I'm quite impressed as well. You have a lot of topics you want to get through this year. Have you already started planning how you're going to integrate them into your courses?
Yeah, actually, so the recursive conversations I already do. So that's already in there. I really find myself wondering whether this applies to writing too. So I'd be really intrigued to kind of compare focus practice kind of writing stuff versus recursive conversations, but you know, it might be slightly different results.
That's a really interesting angle. I've recently myself started writing practice in Korean, and the book I'm using requires repetition. But my problem is I need more models of language because they only model it once or twice. So I've decided to collect models from my friends to try and get more a variety of language that I can use, because it's only a workbook, not a textbook. But are there any other questions for Scott? Okay, I see Emily has a hand raised.
Hi, Scott. Thanks for that. That was really interesting. I was just wondering how the students feel about this. I know often in these situations with these kind of activities, even though the students perform better, often they feel like that they're not like studying and they don't like it as much as, you know, traditional.
So I've done recursive conversations before in a couple of different settings. And what I found is that, and I think it's true not just for recursive conversations, but for anything really, if you, whatever you start off the year doing, students tend to see that as being the way that they should learn. So if you introduce a change kind of like mid-semester, say, they don't like it very much. They think that it's less good. I actually tested this. But if you start with whatever it is you're wanting to do, then whatever it is, they're happy with it. They kind of just assume that whatever they start with is great. Seems to be what happens psychologically. So that was kind of my experience. And I've actually done interviews already. I just haven't got around to really analyzing them properly, but really no difference in enjoyment. In fact, I would say probably the students who do these recursive conversations, because they get to speak to lots of people every class, they tend to enjoy the class more because they're like, I get to make so many friends doing this. So there's that kind of social dimension.
I think that's a really interesting observation. The thing that they start off doing is the thing that they want to kind of stick with. I'll definitely keep that one under my belt as well.
I think it has like an official psychological name, but I can't remember. I remember reading it somewhere.
Any other questions? If it's okay, Scott, I'd like to ask you to stop sharing your screen now. And then we can have a little gallery view, see everyone.